Welcome back to Proof, a pre-election podcast special with Seth Abramson, author of Proof of Collusion, Proof of Conspiracy, and Proof of Corruption, a trilogy which charts the path of Donald Trump from second-generation real estate tycoon to TV character to president, along with the constellation of hilariously disreputable figures who helped him get there, using its own constellation of thousands and thousands of cited sources as a star guide. And also myself, Thomas Morton, author of Jack Squad. This is our 5th episode, and since we've been releasing these suckers on block as we finish them, for ease of consumption, a couple weeks have elapsed since we recorded episode 4, and they have been eventful. Reading the news lately brings to mind the words of Robert Benchley, the great American humorist and member of the Algonquin Round Table aside Dorothy Parker, who once wrote, "All this is, of course, very depressing, and I often give off a low moan at the sight of the new day's metamorphosis, but I can't seem to resist the temptation to learn the worst." Now, he was referring to seeing his own face in the mirror, but I find it every bit as fitting to the experience of trying to keep up with the daily braying lunacy we're festooned with on the internet, television, and to a woefully lesser extent, printed paper. When Seth and I last spoke, we were talking about the coronavirus, which U.S. intelligence first reported on almost a year ago at this point, and which Trump ignored for at least 2 crucial months while he was trying to hammer out a trade deal with China. A trade deal, mind you, and into which China hastily inserted a pandemic clause to cover their asses, just to let you know how good a trade deal we're talking about here. And now we've learned even more early information about the coronavirus. And more spectacularly, Trump has the coronavirus. Or maybe doesn't. Let's try to sort through this crap. Starting with that. How you doing?
About the same as last time.
Yeah.
Except a little bit more so, right? Now that the president maybe or maybe doesn't have COVID.
I guess that's always been the case. He's always maybe or maybe not had COVID. It's just that now we have to guess what, yeah. Sorry, the whole thing is, I get what you're saying about more so, which is just confused, I guess. Generally confused and thinking that confusion is basically sort of the lay of the land.
Well, it's not just the lay of the land. I think that confusion is the point.
Right.
I think that Donald Trump benefits whenever we're confused about basic information that we should have as voters and as Americans. So he won't tell us when the last negative test was. Right. We simply know from the New York Times that he was not being regularly tested. So therefore, we have no idea when he contracted COVID-19 and when he should have started taking protocols under the CDC guidelines. That's completely unclear. His medications that he's received are unclear. Yep. And he's created a massive nationwide deceit matrix that doesn't just spread disinformation, but it also infects the truth, so that there are things that maybe are true or are simple or common, and we start to think of those things as also being potentially untrue. So the entire information matrix begins to collapse.
Hypernormalization is the term they use in Russian, right? Which, I mean, is the English translation of the term they use in Russian, right? Towards the end of a year, not even that close to the end of a year, of 1/5 of a million excess deaths for a very specific reason, which very basic, rudimentary medical protocols would have mitigated. So that is an appropriate place to start. We're in the middle of this shit right now.
The 2 pieces of information that are so foundational to the COVID-19 story that have to be corrected are the following. You touched on the first one, and so it's worth sort of, pulling on that thread a little bit, which is the toll that has been taken to this point so far by Trump administration actions, specifically the actions of Donald Trump. The official death toll is around 220,000. Everyone knows that. They see it on cable news and so on. That's the official death toll. And then we have an official toll of people who have been infected, and that's around 8 million as we sit here right now. Both of those numbers are wrong. We know that they're wrong. Everyone agrees. The CDC agrees. Major media agrees that they're wrong. They're just the best that we have. Both of those numbers are wrong on the low side in an extraordinary fashion. So if 8 million people are actually recorded as being infected because they have cases that are recognized by our public health system, the CDC estimates that between 6 and 24 times that number of people have actually been infected by COVID-19. Now, it's almost impossible to imagine it being 24 because 8 times 24 means 92 million people have been infected by COVID-19. A third of the country. Yeah, so that's unlikely. But let's say it's 6. Let's say it's the lowest end. You have 48 million people in the United States, which is about 1/7 or so of our population, about 14%.
Just 6 New York cities,
Exactly. That has contracted this disease whose long-term effects, I can't underscore it enough, whose long-term effects are unknown. So if you had it and you were asymptomatic, or you just had a slight cold and then it went away, we have no idea what the long-term effects on you will be. And that's terrible to say. I don't say it lightly, but that's important to understand. The death toll is also known to be incorrect. Many months ago, the New York Times determined that there was an undercount of deaths in the United States, meaning that we were having more deaths this year than in any normative year in the United States by an amount of unexplained, an amount of 40 to 60,000. And that was months ago. It is believed by experts that most of those deaths would be attributed to the one thing that's new this year, right, which is COVID-19 as a disease. So there is virtually no question that we have over 250,000, meaning over 250,000 deaths from COVID-19 in the first 7 months of this pandemic. And it could easily be as high as 300,000. So those are the first two things people have to understand is the toll. But then secondly, and I know this is something I harp on a lot on Twitter, the timeline for this pandemic is not properly understood by the American people. If you think you know because you read Bob Woodward's book, or you watch the presidential debate, or you watch the vice presidential debate, or you watch a lot of CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, if you think you know the timeline for this pandemic, I congratulate you for being an active news consumer, but you do not understand the timeline for this pandemic. We have the research that tells us where it started and when, and it's not what's being reported to the American people. To be clear, not because of some conspiracy within the media, but simply because there are certain breaking news reports that came out over the last year that didn't get picked up by other major media outlets, and therefore they just kind of died on the vine. They sort of disappeared. These are reports by ABC News, The Daily Beast, Financial Times, major media outlets, but somehow the story just didn't catch on. And the story that did catch on is something like Bob Woodward's Rage, which has a lot of misinformation taken directly from interviews with Donald Trump, where he's lying to the American people, hoping Bob Woodward will pass it in his book to the American people. And he was right, and it worked, and that happened. It's not a grand conspiracy. It's just a failure of our information transfer systems to ensure that the truth gets to the American people. But everything we talk about on this podcast, as you know, Thomas, and I know our listeners do by now, comes from major media. Right. None of it comes from my speculation or my personal belief. We're just talking about major media articles that slip through the cracks.
Yeah. Well, and as I think it was Gore Vidal who said, you don't have to have a conspiracy when everybody already thinks the same, and in this case, acts the same way. You have a media who's, as we discussed in previous episodes, whose whole modus operandi is beating each other to the punch, competing with each other to release stories as quickly as possible, and to package them as disfluent events in the status quo, but breaks in the to package all the different events as breaks in the norm, as not part of some continuous, ongoing, greater context of things, but as surprises.
Well, I think it's very hard to get an entire country on the same, it's very hard. It's virtually impossible to get an entire country onto the same page in terms of even just a timeline of events. And so I think on some level, what happens, Thomas, is when enough major media organizations have put out there a certain timeline that people are generally willing to accept. And the Woodward timeline, I'll call it for right now, is one that actually both Republicans and Democrats have decided they can live with. Now, Republicans, because it greatly benefits Donald Trump. Democrats, because, we're busy people. We're all busy people, Republicans and Democrats. And Bob Woodward is a trusted figure on the left, in the center, and on the right as one of the reporters who broke the Watergate story 50 years ago. And so if he says, here's the timeline, you can get a lot of the country to adopt it. And because we're all busy people and we have a lot going on, it's only in a podcast like this. It's only in meta-journalism. It's only in selected major media publications that someone might step out and say, I know that we all sort of agreed on this, and that's very convenient that we've kind of reached an accord on this. It happens to be wrong as a matter of fact, not opinion. And so let's get it right. Usually, it's not on something so important that we can't just let it go and say, well, it's fine. Our timeline of some geopolitical conflict in Eastern Europe, well, it's off by a few months, but what's the big deal? This is the biggest thing to happen to the United States from a public health standpoint in over a century. We have to get it right down to the day. And at this point, and it's still going. Yeah.
It's still going. And the person who was responsible for responding to it at the highest level of government in the first place is up for re-election and is threatening, essentially, to keep not responding to it in the same way. I saw, and I'm trying to remember the exactly who said this in the New York Times, that there was a discussion. Did you see this about the Superman shirt?
Oh, yes.
Where it came from, how they got that information, because it came from a phone call he had while at the hospital.
Actually, it came from several calls.
Okay. Yeah.
So Donald Trump, pretty consistently for his whole presidency, has made a lot of phone calls from his private residence, a lot of phone calls on unsecured phones, a lot of phone calls to people he wasn't supposed to be calling without being supervised by the National Security Agency. And this was a series of ill-advised calls in which he was putting forward an idea he had for how to exit the hospital.
Right. Okay. So in one of these unsupervised calls, then he suggested that when you leave the hospital, presumably tailed by cameras, that he would pretend to be frail and weak. And then he'd basically do a Willy Wonka where he would, but instead of, doing a double somersault and jumping up, he would rip open his shirt, revealing a Superman shirt underneath it, which is both I guess he's a 70-year-old man, so maybe that's a little less like kindergarten seeming to him. Maybe he thinks that still resonates with a slightly more mature fan base.
He's also clinically obese. I'm not sure how many Superman movies he's seen.
Or if they could find a shirt that size that wouldn't, that would have the flattering effect that I think he's going to, maybe he's just seen too many of those weird kind of 4chan characters of himself where he's somehow buff. But in any case, what I thought was interesting was that this plan, which was kiboshed, thankfully, and which I don't know how good a job he would have done of in the first place, just given his few outings in cameos doing any sort of acting or on the World Wrestling, I think it was WWF. Nevertheless, his plan was to deceive, or it was to deceive and then downplay what had happened to him from the get-go, which then dovetails in the Big Woodward interview, his admission of downplaying the virus from the early days of, I think it's February and March, so as not to cite a panic. But then, in my mind, also just kind of seemed to go with his usual operating style of just disregarding things. In general, I think in an earlier episode, I mentioned the first week of his presidency when there was a just minor natural disaster in South Georgia, North Florida, which required small amount of federal emergency aid that just never got addressed. He never said yes to or no to, just ignored it until it went away eventually. And this seems to be a case where it's it's not only that this is just a habit he's got, but as he's describing his plan to pretend to have been hit harder by COVID than he was, and then to suddenly rip open his shirt and be like, haha, I wasn't actually hit hard by this disease that has, killed numerous people across the country, including, friends and friends' family members. That not only does he habitually ignore things, but that's actually part of the plan, that he's cognizant of the fact that neglecting things until they present a solution to him or until they go away isn't just a byproduct of his incompetence, but is something he's actually seized upon as a working model.
Well, he treats every situation as a performance. And I don't think that necessarily automatically that disqualifies him from American politics, because admittedly, so much of American politics is a performance. But with Donald Trump, I think there's something beyond that. Someone who's a Trump supporter and how they might look at this Superman idea that Trump came up with. You think that the numbers, and you're wrong about this, but you think that the number of dead from COVID-19 is grossly exaggerated. You think it's only 50,000 Americans who have died rather than 250,000 who have died of an incurable illness in the last 7 months in America. Let's imagine that you think that the economy should be reopened immediately, but you also recognize that the economy has collapsed. Let's say that your child is back at school, but you don't believe they're getting the same level of education that they were getting before the pandemic. You'd still have a lot to think about in terms of this situation being very serious. You'd be very concerned about your child's education. You'd be very concerned about the economy. You might not be as upset as we might think you would be about 50,000 people dying, if that's the number who you think have died. But still, 50,000 people dying of an incurable ailment that's passing through the United States is pretty scary. If your president is someone who likes to engage in performances, this is not the moment when you think that they should be performing a Laurel and Hardy routine or a Benny Hill routine or some sort of jokey rip off your shirt and show that you're Superman routine, because that makes the entire situation about you. It suggests that you don't understand the seriousness of the situation. It suggests that you turned to deceit, even to your fans, even momentarily, at a time when you need to be sober, serious, candid, and direct. I don't know who that sort of performance appeals to, except the sort of person who doesn't care how many Americans die, who don't care what happens to our reputation abroad, who don't care what happens to our economy, who don't care what happens to this generation of children, as long as the libs get owned by being annoyed for a moment on social media. And I will tell you what, as someone who is progressive, that's not a lot of value that you're getting for your presidency. If all you're doing is getting liberals riled up for a few minutes a day because of a Superman routine the president did, I think you'd rather have those 50,000 lives back. I think you'd rather have your economy back. I think you'd rather have, kids in school with everything going normally. I think you'd rather have this pandemic under control than just seeing a few people you dislike on social media be upset for a few seconds. It just doesn't make sense. And so the fact that he even considered this, really quickly, Thomas, because this makes me think of an article I wrote right before the 2016 election for the Huffington Post about a situation Donald Trump was in that just beggars belief. He had a close friend of his who was a Mormon executive in the west of the United States for one of his properties. Very popular person in Utah, which I mentioned just because going into the 2016 campaign, there was some thought because of Evan McMullin running for president that Utah could be closer than people thought.
Evan McMullin is a former CIA agent who decided to run for president as an independent in August 2016, right after Trump got the Republican nomination, in an attempt to siphon away conservative votes. He's a textbook never Trumper, also a textbook third-party candidate.
So I was looking into this and I wrote this article about this Mormon executive who had died many, many years ago in a helicopter accident. And he was a friend of Donald Trump's. Donald Trump found out that his friend had died in a helicopter accident while Donald Trump was in Trump Tower in a meeting with a bunch of people. He got the call. He found out about the death. Shortly thereafter, very shortly thereafter, he gets a call from media asking him for a reaction to his friend's helicopter death that had happened just hours earlier. And in front of all the people he's meeting with, he says, "You're going to hate me for this, but I got to do this. I can get some publicity out of this." He takes the phone off mute with the journalist who had called him, and he says that he had been scheduled to be on the helicopter that crashed. It was a lie. It has been established as a lie, but it made the story about Donald Trump, not about the friend of his who had kids and a family who had tragically died in a helicopter accident. That's an example of a situation where everyone in that room should have understood at that moment, this man will continue his performance, continue making things about him, continuing being deceitful, no matter who dies. Now, that was just one death back then, decades ago, with this Mormon business executive connected to Trump through the Trump Organization. That was one person. Now, whether you think it's 50,000, which is wrong, or 250,000, which is still low, or 300,000 people dead, which is probably correct, Donald Trump still makes it about him. And there's no one in America who benefits from that.
Yeah. I mean, he's like the kid when some other kid at the school dies is suddenly that kid's best friend. But at least that guy is kind of hawking on sympathy and not trying to get in front of a camera, not trying to publicize himself. There was a line of thinking that describes that I was trying to kind of wrap my head around, and that was in remembering the quote from 2016, in which he said, if he was so popular and he was so his base was so set in their support for him that if he were to go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot people, they would still support him. I remember thinking that this was, this line was taken as a glib and grim kind of, the glib and grim pronouncement that it was. which is dark enough. But what struck me was that not only was he not being caught saying this, or had he, just like had a thought, a grim thought that maybe could take anybody in that position of a certain disposition and given it air, but that he had written that into a speech, essentially. That he wasn't just the type of person who, how to say this? He wasn't just the type of person who had that thought. He was the type of person who thought having that type of thought was a great thing, was something worth promoting about himself. And the case you mentioned with the helicopter death is one in which a slightly less kind of insidious person could have done the exact same thing and made the story about themselves without alerting everybody in his presence to that fact. But nevertheless, he has to say that, just make it explicit that this is about getting publicity for me.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's actually a part of the story that I only paid attention to from the standpoint of it being a confession of him saying, look, this isn't true, but I'm going to say this to the journalist because I can get publicity out of this. But you're right. The fact that he wanted to alert the people around him, because essentially he wanted double credit. He wanted the credit falsely for having almost been on the helicopter when that wasn't true. To be very clear, he was never going to be on that flight. He also, in the context of doing something so vile, he wanted credit from the people at the meeting for having thought of the idea that this could be used for publicity. So you're exactly right. He doesn't just want you to know that he could kill people on, Fifth Avenue and get away with it. He wants you to know that he put that in the speech and that that's his idea and that it comes from him. And how smart is he to realize that he has in his own mind this power? If I can add to that. So I want to go back to this Woodward thing. I said that there were two major facts that have to be understood. Number one is the death toll and the infection toll and getting those numbers right. But I want us to imagine, Donald Trump talking to Bob Woodward in a phone interview that he knows is being recorded about the timeline for COVID-19. And so Donald Trump has to decide, how am I going to set this timeline? Well, if you're Donald Trump, think of everything we just said about Donald Trump, everything you all know about Donald Trump listening to this. He's, of course, going to start the narrative with himself. No question about that. He's not going to care about when anyone else knew anything about COVID-19. No malignant narcissist who has sociopathic tendencies, as Donald Trump does, is going to care about anyone else's role in the story. It's about him. So he starts the story with January 28th, 2020, with Bob Woodward for a very specific reason. Now he may have known from Bob Woodward's fear that Woodward at this point in his career is largely going to just repeat what he's getting from interviews. And so Trump may have been thinking, well, I can kind of say anything at this point and it's going to end up in the book. That might have been part of the consideration. But even beyond that, he thought to himself, okay, on January 29th is when I issued the order for this so-called ban on travel from China, which of course was not a travel ban. It had so many intentional loopholes that 40,000 people came to the US from China after this supposed ban. So it's not a ban. Whenever I say the word ban, I'm saying it facetiously. But on January 29th, he issued the order for this quote unquote ban that for some reason, by the way, didn't take effect until February 2nd. So he didn't even think it was so important of an announcement by the president of the United States and a new piece of regulation in the United States that he had to have it take effect immediately. It didn't take effect for several days. But it's on the 29th that he does that. So of course, he wants to focus on the 28th so that he can say, here's when I first learned about it, and look at what I did. Within 24 hours, I took action on this virus. And then, of course, he lies about the efficacy of the action and the nature of the action and whether it had anything to do with what the U.S. was facing at the time, which it turns out that it didn't. But that's why he wants the timeline to start there. Thomas, if I could, can I tell you the actual timeline for how this all went down? I think people will be very interested to know.
Please.
So first of all, people should understand COVID-19 is not the name of the virus. COVID-19 is the name of the illness that the virus causes.
It's like HIV and AIDS. Yeah.
Exactly right. And so the virus that we are talking about is called the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That virus, according to medical research, has been found in water samples taken from both Europe and South America in the spring and summer of 2019.
This is evidence that the coronavirus existed and was beginning to spread at least half a year before the outbreak at Wuhan and before it was identified as a novel disease.
So let's be very clear. We have no evidence at this point, none, that the virus originated in China. The virus certainly spread in China. That's where it became an epidemic. The virus began sickening people in large numbers in China. Absolutely correct. We know that for sure. And any fudging of the numbers that the Chinese government was playing around with in 2019 or 2020 isn't going to change that. Everyone agrees that's where the outbreak was in the epidemic. But the virus starts earlier, spring, summer 2019, Europe and South America. What happens is that according to survey, and this is all taken from major media reports, none of this is my opinion, none of this is from an anonymous, silly blog. This is all major media reporting, NBC, ABC, CBS News, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and so on. Surveillance imagery from the Wuhan area in China from late September of 2019 shows a massive run on the hospitals in Wuhan in late September, an inexplicable run on those hospitals with cars everywhere, crowded emergency rooms. We know this from satellite imagery. Now, we don't know for certain that that was the first outbreak of the virus in China, but we have a pretty good sense, given that it was so out of the ordinary that we had seen nothing like it for years, that it's consistent with a very large number of people in the place where we know the outbreak happened, suddenly having to go to the hospital. But we also have another piece of information, which is that WeChat, which is the chief social media platform in China, sees a spike in searches for terms that relate to the virus and the illness that it causes in mid-November. But let's be very clear, that's a spike in searches. The searches begin in October, possibly late September. It's simply that those search strings hit a clear spike in mid-November. So the initial run of a large number of people getting ill in Wuhan, China, from a virus that originated elsewhere appears to be in late September, early October. Searches for the symptoms of contracting this virus and getting what we now know as the disease of COVID-19, searches for that are rising in China in October of 2019, and they hit a peak in November. So while this is happening, right, in China, between September and November, the question has to be asked, what is happening in the United States while this is happening in China? And there are a few things that are happening that people have to know about. One is that there is a massive government-run simulation called Crimson Contagion that is playing out, that is gaming exactly the scenario that is unfolding in China as it is unfolding. And it comes to the conclusion that if there's an airborne virus that is spread in certain ways that begins in China in 2019 or thereafter, it is going to become a pandemic. It will kill potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of Americans. And this simulation is actually passed to the Trump White House in the fall, actually the late summer, early fall of 2019, telling them you have to be on the lookout for this. But simultaneously, the White House had gotten two of its economists to do their own study of what would happen if exactly the situation that actually is unfolding in China happens. And they found exactly the same thing. And they passed forward their work to the White House in 2019. Hundreds of thousands, possibly, in fact, even likely, millions of Americans will die if this happens. Simultaneously, the White House has two comprehensive pandemic response plans and a pandemic response team that it has inherited from the Obama administration. And let's be very clear, these plans and this team are not partisan. They were created by the Obama administration, but they're simply public health documents within the government to make sure that we always respond in the appropriate way to a pandemic and have a team that can do so. What does Donald Trump do? He fires the entire pandemic response team. It appears simply because Obama had created it. Out of spite, he gets rid of the team, not because he isn't being told by everyone we're really worried a pandemic is going to hit soon. Moreover, he ignores those two pandemic response plans. There's more that happens in November, but those are the early months.
The very idea that that everything, and this relates also to Hillary Clinton's sudden reappearance in the last week. What amazes me is the firing of the pandemic team, which when I heard about that was obviously in the context of COVID already having, kind of reached the United States and it already becoming a political issue. And then the debate being over whether he was, they were fired out of spite or because they were unnecessary. Either way, it's seeming like basically which is the worst of two evils. Either thinking something is unnecessary simply because we haven't experienced the thing that it is, it has been created as a precautionary front for, or simply dismantling absolutely everything that your predecessor did because you dislike the person enough to stage strange videos using a lookalike.
Right, the Apprentice video where Donald Trump fires a fake Obama, right?
Yeah. This is the video Trump filmed for the 2012 Republican National Convention, in which he fired a second-rate Obama impersonator as if they were appearing on The Apprentice. It got cut from the convention's televised schedule, but made an appearance in Michael Cohen's book. All these things, just the maturity level, the fact that everybody went along with it, and the fact that, nobody raised any sort of stink over these things until they had to cover their tracks about it or respond to it in public. Well, I mean, it's a mindfuck. And then to try to assert that a pandemic response team would have a political dimension prior to him taking office, that basically anything that Obama did must have been touched with the taint of Obama. Even, it's like, is he suspicious of the trash cans that Obama had in office? Does he have to, how much political ill will can one person project into the entire workings of a government?
Well, as you said, Thomas, if we look at it as there are two possibilities. One is spite. One is that he thought that the pandemic response team was unnecessary or redundant. The reason I say that it definitely of those two has to be spite is because every entity within the government was actually telling Donald Trump that the biggest threat the U.S. was facing in terms of American deaths, right? Let's not think just geopolitically. Let's specifically think about a threat to the homeland that would kill people. Crimson Contagion was telling him, two White House economists were telling him, the pandemic response plans were telling him, and the pandemic response team was telling him that this was the biggest threat to the American homeland. This is what would kill the most people. That was also the most likely. So it's not, this would kill a lot of people, but it's not going to happen. He was being told this will kill a lot of people, and it's very likely. And he was ignoring them. Now, what is the other thing we find with Donald Trump that is consistent in addition to him taking any tragedy and making it about himself and not caring about loss of human life as long as he can remain the focus of attention? Well, the other thing that we find about Donald Trump is that he does not accept information in his perimeter that is contrary to his personal, internal, idiosyncratic, highly emotionalized narrative about what should be the focus of attention, and that's him. The focus of attention in a pandemic is not on the president's tweets. It's not on the president's speeches. It's on doctors. It's on experts. Donald Trump has handled this pandemic exactly as you would expect someone with his personality disorder to handle it. He's made the whole thing about him. So when he was hearing from Crimson Contagion, when he was hearing from his economists and his pandemic response team, you need to focus on this thing that will be outside your control and that will turn focus away from you. His reaction, we already know what it must have been because we've seen what it actually was in reality. Well, no, I don't accept this information. I'm going to reject it because reality is however I construct it. The focus must always be on me. And I have the ability through my words and my tweets, and because I'm the sort of person who could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not face any consequences, to shape reality however I want it. That is such a, excuse my language, batshit crazy way of thinking about public policy and public health, that it was a danger to the United States the moment we discovered he was this sort of man, which of course was in the 1980s, 40 years before, where we are right now in 2020. But let me follow up on that, Thomas, and say something further. Because where our story continues in November 2019 is now what happens in 2019 is not just that Crimson Contagion and the economists and the pandemic response documents are saying this is serious, it's likely to happen, it will kill millions of Americans. U.S. military intelligence comes to the White House and to the Pentagon multiple times in November 2019 and says the following: it's happening. It's actually happening. The thing you've been warned about that's going to kill the largest number of Americans that we told you was likely is happening. It's happening in China. And as you know, by this point, the hospitals have been full in China in September and October. WeChat is going crazy, and U.S. military intelligence picks up all these signals, goes to the White House, goes to the Pentagon, says it's happening. And you know what happens? The White House rejects the intelligence. According to multiple major media outlets, the White House rejects the intelligence. Now, people hear me say that, and your first question should be, what does that even mean?
Right.
What does it mean to have your military intelligence come to you and say the thing that's going to kill all of us in America has happened, and you quote unquote reject it? Who has the authority in the White House to reject it, to say, we don't want to hear any more about this? We're done with this topic. We don't take it seriously. We're not going to set policy based on this. Go away. There's only one person in the Trump White House who has that authority, and only one person in the Trump White House who has the personality disorder that would lead to them making that decision, and that is Donald Trump. So multiple briefings happen of the White House and the Pentagon in November. The White House rejects those briefings to the point that the Pentagon, this is also in major media accounts, and this is stupendous. Stupendous isn't the right word. This is stupefying information. The Pentagon and U.S. military intelligence has to go to NATO and the IDF. Now, you might say, why would they go to NATO and the IDF? Well, those are our two allied entities that are essentially military intelligence, but that are not the United States. So if you were U.S. military intelligence and the White House rejects your military intelligence, you're trying to save as many lives as possible. You go to America's allies. You go to NATO and say, well, let's see if we can save some French people. Let's see if we can save some Germans. And we're going to go to the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, because of course Israel is our ally. Let's try and save some Israelis, because we can't save Americans because Donald Trump's White House has rejected this intelligence. And we have confirmation from Israeli media that the IDF got this information in November. We have confirmation that NATO got this. So the denials that subsequently come from political appointees within the Trump administration's military entities, well, no, there was never any such intelligence of this sort. First of all, that's exactly what they say when there's a leak about intelligence, but it doesn't even matter anyway, because the Israelis, our allies, have already confirmed that they got this intelligence in November, and there's no way U.S. military intelligence is giving intelligence to the IDF and not to the White House. Right. But as I said, it doesn't matter because major media reported it did go to the White House. What happens in December 2019? The briefings continue. These are regular briefings to the White House and to the Pentagon, but now there's a new entity that comes into play. Another entity besides the intelligence community that Donald Trump loves to attack. The World Health Organization has American employees who are working in Europe, and in December, they start passing information to public health officials in the Trump administration saying, this thing is happening in China. It is really bad. It is going to become a pandemic. You have to take this seriously. So through unofficial channels, not through an official World Health Organization report, but through unofficial channels, the Trump administration is also now hearing from WHO, the WHO. Right. Donald Trump will later say that we didn't know anything from WHO until the end of December. And he's able to say that, though it is a lie, he's able to say it because WHO doesn't issue a formal report until the very end of December. But we were getting plenty of information from WHO prior to that. What Donald Trump also would have done if Bob Woodward had actually pressed him on this is he would have claimed that U.S. intelligence didn't ever get him any information about the pandemic until January 2020, because it's true, this limited fact is true, that the first time it shows up in Donald Trump's President's Daily Brief, his PDB, is in the first 72 hours of January 2020. So Donald Trump, when he's been ignoring something for months, because it doesn't center him and it doesn't fit with his political agenda, and he thinks it could hurt the U.S. economy, which is what he expects will cause him to be reelected. When he ignores something for months, he waits until a report is issued that forces him to acknowledge that he knew something. With the World Health Organization, it's the final day of December 2019 in which he says, okay, I got that report. With the PDB, that's the first formal, acknowledged, no one is denying it time that he gets briefed about the virus, and that's in the first 72 hours of 2020. Bob Woodward shows up and does him the enormous favor of accepting the idea that Donald Trump knew nothing about this until January 28th. If you were the most charitable Trump supporter in the United States, you would have to say he knew about it when he got his president's daily brief on January 2nd or January 3rd, which is almost 4 weeks earlier, almost a month earlier than the Woodward timeline. And so finally, I'll close this little chapter of the timeline by saying, okay, well, what happens in January? Donald Trump, who's been blowing this off for weeks, finally gets it in a formal report. We don't know whether he read it or listened to it, though it was delivered to him face-to-face in early January. What does he do for the next month? And this, to me, is the most incredible part of the story. He and his aides block anyone from DHHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, from briefing him for the entire month of January. The Secretary of HHS, Alex Azar, is desperately trying to get into the Oval Office to give a full briefing to the president about what he thinks needs to be done. And the short version is emergency evasive maneuvers for the entire country. And he's being blocked by Kellyanne Conway and other aides to Donald Trump. The only reason that the information breaks through to Donald Trump and he's forced to deal with it in January 28th is that one of his top advisors, a man named Peter Navarro, writes a report and distributes it so widely throughout the executive branch of the U.S. government that Donald Trump can no longer ignore what's out there. It's sort of like that scene in Jerry Maguire when he writes up that, if you've seen the movie Jerry Maguire.
It's been a bit.
He writes up a sort of green paper or a white paper, and he distributes it to his entire office by putting it in everyone's mailboxes. That's basically what Peter Navarro did. He made sure everyone knew about this. So now it became an embarrassment to Donald Trump if he didn't do anything, and he's forced to hold a meeting with his advisors on January 28th, and he issues the meaningless China order that had no effect whatsoever on the spread of the virus. Why? And here's the real kicker to this part of the story, because the virus was already in the United States in late November 2019 and December 2019. We had community spread in this country of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in December 2019. Donald Trump acting on travel from China on February 2nd in a way that still had 40,000 people come to this country from China afterward was completely irrelevant to what was going to happen with the virus in the United States, because to the extent the virus was still coming into this country from overseas, in January, it was coming from Europe, not from China. That is the primary spread. Europe, specifically to New York City, is what was happening in January. So Donald Trump was months behind, and when he finally did something, it was meaningless.
It was worthless. One of the other things that really struck me was that, just from my own mind, in consideration of an out-of-control, act of God sort of scenario, like a pandemic, there's a tremendous sort of nonpartisan political opportunity for anybody who's in charge to, use it as you would any crisis and exert your own leadership. That in a really realpolitik kind of Machiavellian mercenary sort of way, you could look at it as a benefit to an otherwise, flagging presidency, that this disaster unfolds because there should be only one way to respond to it, which is to call off any sort of infighting and make the issue about you as a channel for, the latest medical information. Like, why isn't that his response to this day, to the point that he's presumably gotten the virus? Like, that's the part that, for everything else that kind of makes sense in a twisted way about the psychology of Donald Trump, still eludes me. That this was a prime political opportunity that it seems like he wasted. Where were his politics at that moment? Where were they focused?
We actually have the answer to that from major media reporting. I would sort of set it up this way. I would ask our listeners here, or frankly, I could ask Trump supporters, what's the top thing that motivates Donald Trump? Everyone's going to give you the same answer, money. I mean, there's no one who doesn't think Donald Trump is primarily motivated by money. I'm sure he has some supporters who think that he's motivated by patriotism, but they fundamentally love him because they see him as a winner who spent so many decades motivated by money that in their view, it turns out falsely, he became a successful businessman. So how does money play into what happens in February 2020 and early March 2020? Because some people would say, well, Seth, it's money, but also power. He wants to stay president. Well, this is the perfect storm. What was motivating him in February and early March of 2020? Two things: money and getting reelected. And I'll explain how those come together. They come together in Wall Street. They come together in the market. All of the evidence we have from major media is that Donald Trump's biggest fear, I almost feel like I should say this 20 times in a row, but I won't because it's so horrifying. His biggest fear was not that people would die from the virus. That is still not his big concern. His concern was that the economy would collapse, making it impossible for him to be reelected. And lest you think that he didn't want the economy to collapse because he was worried about people losing their jobs, he only was worried about that, according to all the evidence we have, because he believed the collapse of the economy would cause people to be angry with him and prohibit his reelection. And he would lose himself a lot of money and his friends, the people he cares about in the world, because they donate to him and because they keep him part of high society. His friends who are in high society would lose money as well. So Wall Street is that perfect storm of money and power. And so here's how that actually plays out in a way that leads to dead Americans. And there's a direct line between Donald Trump thinking about money, power, Wall Street, and re-election in February and March 2020, and people dying. Here's what happened. HHS, Alex Azar's department, the Department of Health and Human Services, had control of pandemic response in January. As I mentioned already, it was trying to get the White House to take action for all of January on the pandemic. And the White House wouldn't even let Azar get to the president. Through February, it's starting to have more success in changing White House policy because now Donald Trump has sort of crossed the Rubicon of acknowledging the existence of the pandemic and creating this fake, ineffective, loophole-filled China, quote-unquote, travel ban that wasn't a ban. So the one mistake that HHS makes, the Rubicon that HHS crosses that it can't uncross.
Meta Rubicon.
Yeah, Rubicon, the river that once you've crossed it, you can't uncross it because it's the one river that you can never go back across, is the following. There's an employee, there's someone who is a subordinate to Alex Azar, who makes a public statement that a journalist publishes that the pandemic is likely to be incredibly disruptive, possibly even ruinous to the U.S. economy, and says this publicly as a representative of the U.S. government in early March of 2020. We know what happens at that point because many major media outlets have reported on it. And what happens is Donald Trump goes ballistic. He starts shouting at Alex Azar on the phone because now suddenly the one message that couldn't get out of hand for him, which is the economy will be fine, I'm going to be reelected, no one's going to lose money, I'm going to remain in power because this pandemic may kill people, but it won't affect the economy. Now that narrative is out of his control because HHS has picked it up and essentially given the lie to that premise that everything's going to be fine economically with this statement by Azar's subordinate. He wants Azar to fire this person, but that's not even enough. He says, I'm taking all of pandemic response away from HHS, and I'm giving it to someone who I know will do whatever I say under any circumstance and who works in my building right down the hallway, and that's Mike Pence, my vice president. So from March 2nd to March 16th, U.S. pandemic response at the critical moment in the virus spreading in the United States is doing nothing. U.S. pandemic response is idling. It's a car that's idling. It's a ship that has becalmed and is sitting in the water and not moving because the control of pandemic response is being passed from HHS for these 2 weeks to the vice president's office purely because Donald Trump commanded it and was angry about this one statement from an HHS employee. According to the Washington Post, more than 90% of U.S. deaths, so we're talking about at this point over 180,000 dead Americans, can be linked to the total lack of action in pandemic response in those critical 2 weeks from March 2nd to March 16th of 2020. And here's the wild thing. When Donald Trump ends that period of inaction, and again, you might say, how could inaction in just 2 weeks have that effect? That is considered to be the critical 2-week period when the U.S. had to take immediate, dramatic, historic action to stop the spread of the virus. When Donald Trump ultimately does take action at the end of that period, it's to create a Europe travel ban. But as we know from the timeline that I've been laying out here, it's now far too late. The virus has been pouring in from Europe to the United States at this point for 2 months, over 2 months, in fact, since late 2019. And Donald Trump issuing this ban has no effect because community spread has already begun. But here's the crazy thing. Even when he issues that travel ban involving Europe in mid-March, he exempts the 2 countries in Europe that play host to a Trump golf course. I kid you not, it's incredible to think about in retrospect. He takes so much heat for it that within 72 hours, he has to impose a ban on those countries also, which happen to be the United Kingdom and Ireland. But we don't know how many people traveled from those countries in those 3 days, probably a lot. And frankly, it doesn't matter because the order itself didn't matter. It was irrelevant by that point. But the fact that he would put his business interests so clearly ahead of the United States, even in mid-March 2020, which is over a month after he tells Bob Woodward by telephone, this is far more deadly a virus than the flu. This is really dangerous. It's going to get a lot of people sick. 5 weeks later, he's still exempting his golf courses from travel orders. That's how much this man doesn't care about human life.
Yeah. And just leaving it open. If by some weird fluke, there was something else in his mind to exempt the UK and Ireland, not even recognizing or having anybody on his staff recognize that that could be seen as a conflict of interest and, should be avoided or should be prepared for, or should, there should be something out front to keep it from looking that way. Doesn't even matter. Everything's out in the open.
Well, and it is remarkable how March 2020, ushers in this period in the pandemic timeline that really is defined by what you were just talking about, Thomas. It's defined by Donald Trump's conflicts of interest. He ultimately is forced to forego the conflict of interest involving his golf courses in mid-March. But what happens not long after mid-March? He starts pushing hydroxychloroquine as a treatment that he says is going to cure anyone who gets COVID-19.
Hydroxychloroquine was an existing medication that was in the middle of being studied for whether or not it could be effective against the novel coronavirus when Trump started promoting it and one of his fans OD'd by taking a heaping teaspoon of it.
Hydroxychloroquine, of course, we now know, and you can read about this in my book, Proof of Corruption, is being pushed by Trump mega donors who have actually invested in this drug. Donald Trump himself has a reasonably large investment through one of his funds in the maker of the drug hydroxychloroquine. There is no evidence whatsoever that the drug is effective. There is some evidence that it could kill people who take it. Donald Trump starts giving it, this blows my mind even to this day, starts giving it en masse to veterans through the Veterans Administration. Heroes who have served our country are given doses of hydroxychloroquine, and the Veterans Administration within the Trump administration buys an insane number of doses of hydroxychloroquine, enriching Trump, enriching his donors, enriching his friends, and potentially risking the lives of American soldiers because he knows, Donald Trump does, this is his MO since he got into politics, that if he can help enrich his friends through Wall Street, or through drugs like hydroxychloroquine, or more currently, through Regeneron, if he can enrich his friends, they will donate money to his political campaign. It's a very particular sort of small m, small l money laundering that may or may not even be illegal, but essentially it has to be caught on the front end as what we would call a bribe, under the bribery statute, which is a federal felony and also a high crime under the Constitution that's impeachable. You have to catch it when it's a bribe, because if the bribe occurs and Donald Trump changes policy and his friends get rich because of it, and then they donate money to him, it's very hard to get them under a money laundering statute or election fraud or some other similar statute, because they'll always be able to claim, hey, I wanted to give this money to Donald Trump. You can't tie it to me being happy about Donald Trump regarding this policy or his statements about a drug that I support. Of course, I give money to people who agree with me on things. That's not criminal. So what happens on the front end, though, is that Donald Trump starts taking bribes. He becomes essentially a war profiteer by his own definition, because he says that he's now a president at war. He says we're at war with the virus, and he starts pumping up drugs like Regeneron and hydroxychloroquine and others that he has a stake in and his friends do, so that he can now at least make money off the pandemic. Because here's what's consistent with 2016 and 2020. Donald Trump never thought he was going to win in 2016. We now have many major media reports on this. And he told all his friends, well, at least I'm going to get rich because of this presidential run. In 2020, when the virus started to hit, I think he feared that he could no longer be reelected, particularly when the economy started to collapse. So what did he do? He did the same thing he said he was going to do in 2016. He started to at least make sure that he could be rich. And so when you saw his essentially commercial for Regeneron a few days ago, which is, again, a drug that his friends are pushing and that he has a stake in, you see a man who thinks he might well lose the presidency, and he's at least going to make some money off it. Nowhere in his calculation do American dead factor into the picture. Nowhere does the health of the American veterans at the Veterans Administration or being serviced by the Veterans Administration, as he considers them, we now know, losers and suckers.
So there we are. That brings us up to where we're at with less than a month to the election and a pandemic still claiming lives worldwide. October, however, is, at least according to the Druidic Celts, the annual period of time in which the veil between our waking reality and the other world is at its thinnest, and therefore a prime opportunity for trickery and confusion, be it performed by roving spirits or, Karl Rove-inspired campaign managers. Join us next episode as we lay out all the different stops the Trump campaign has pulled so far and which ones they have left at their disposal as we careen headlong towards Samhain. Halloween. I mean the 2020 election. Sorry, it's confusing.